Hey guys, welcome back. Tonight, we're not starting with a king or a battle or a dramatic fall from grace. Those are 4 other nights. Tonight, we're going somewhere quieter, somewhere smaller, a place of gentle steam and drying herbs. A room where the most dramatic thing that might happen is a pot boiling over. So, if you're ready to just drift for a while, find a comfortable spot, dim the lights, maybe get a blanket. This is a story about the mundane, the everyday, the quiet, unrecorded work that kept a medieval household from a modest manor to a sprawling castle, from simply falling apart. We're going to spend a little time in the still room. It wasn't called a still room because it was quiet, though it often was. The name comes from the still, the apparatus for distillation, a complicated tangle of pots and tubes and coils that, in the right hands, could coax the essential spirit from wine or the fragrant soul from a bundle of lavender. But most of the time, the still room wasn't about high alchemy. It was about soap. It was about candles. It was about salves for rashes and potions for sour stomachs. This was the domain of the lady of the house, or more accurately, the woman who ran the household. Because while the lord was off being lordly, managing estates, dispensing justice, or getting himself into politically inadvisable wars, the castle itself was a complex machine that required constant, meticulous maintenance. And a huge part of that maintenance was producing everything you needed to get through the day, the week, the year. You couldn't just run to the market for a bottle of laundry detergent. You had to make it. From ash and tallow and a whole lot of frustration. So let's just imagine we're there. It's a gray morning, the kind where the light seems to seep through the thick glass of the windows rather than boldly shine. The room is warm, humid from a perpetually simmering cauldron. The air is thick with the smell of wood smoke, of melting beeswax, of drying rosemary and sage hanging in bunches from the rafters. It's a comforting smell in its own way. If you ignore the underlying scent of lye, which is decidedly less comforting. Our protagonist for this quiet scene isn't a famous historical figure. She has no portrait, no chronicled life. She's just the lady of this particular manor. Let's call her Eleanor. Not because it's romantic, but because it was a common name, and history, for most people, is about being common. Eleanor is overseeing the quarterly soap making. Because, of course, you didn't make soap every day. It was a huge, messy, all-day ordeal that everyone probably dreaded. The process began, as so many unglamorous things do, with ash. Great barrels of ash collected from every fireplace in the house. This ash was packed into a special wooden trough with a tap at the bottom called a leach. Then water was slowly poured over it. What dripped out of the tap was a brown, caustic liquid known as lye. It was the first and most important ingredient. Testing the strength of the lye was a crucial step. You could drop a feather in it. If the feather dissolved, the lye was too strong. Or, and this was the more common method, you could float a fresh egg in it. If the egg sank, the lye was too weak. If it floated with a specific portion of its shell showing above the surface, it was just right. It was a delicate balance. Get it wrong, and your soap would be either useless sludge or a substance that would strip the skin from your hands. No pressure. While the lye was being prepared, another, equally fragrant task was underway. Rendering fat, animal fat, or tallow, was the other key component. This wasn't the nice, clean fat you might buy today. This was fat scraped from carcasses, saved from cooking, often a bit gamey. It was melted down in great kettles, strained to remove any bits of tissue or char, and then you had a vat of hot, smelly grease. So now, the scene in the still room is one of controlled chaos. You have vats of corrosive brown lye and kettles of bubbling, pungent animal fat. The combination of these two smells is an acquired taste. It's the smell of cleanliness in the 14th century, an ironic contrast, if ever there was one. The actual making of the soap involved slowly, carefully combining the lye and the fat while heating them together. It was a long, slow process of stirring and waiting. If you've ever made a roux or a custard and had to stand there for what feels like an eternity, constantly stirring to avoid disaster, you have a small, modern glimpse into the tedium. This could take hours. The mixture would slowly thicken, a process known as saponification, a fancy word for turning two deeply unpleasant things into one marginally more useful thing. Once it reached the right consistency, it was poured into wooden frames to cool and harden. The result was a soft, brown, jelly-like soap. It wasn't pretty. It certainly wasn't fragrant. It was functional. It was used for everything from washing clothes to scrubbing floors. For personal washing, you might try to improve it. You could add sand or ashes to make a scouring soap for really grimy hands. Or, if you were feeling fancy, you could add dried, powdered herbs like lavender or rose petals to mask the fundamental aroma of cooked fat and ash. It was a losing battle, but people tried. And this was just one day, one product. Let's float over to the other side of the room, where the herbs are. The still room was also the medieval pharmacy. Every good household grew a physic garden, full of plants whose uses had been passed down for generations. A mix of genuine efficacy and what we'd now call sympathetic magic. The lady of the house for the entire household, from her own family down to the lowliest scullion. Her textbooks were handwritten volumes called leech books, which contained a fascinating and often alarming collection of remedies. For a headache, you might make a poultice of betony and vinegar. For a cough, a syrup of horehound and honey. For a wound, you'd reach for yarrow, known as soldiers' woundwort, because it helps staunch bleeding. This was the good, sensible stuff. It worked, more or less. Plants are clever that way. But then, the leech books would take a turn. For melancholy, you might be prescribed a tea made from borage to bring courage. Or for warts, you might be told to steal a piece of beef, rub it on the wart, and then bury the meat. As it rotted in the ground, so too would the wart disappear. Sympathetic magic. The idea that like affects like. It was a system built on observation, but not always the right kind observation. And then there were the remedies that just seemed to be a cry for help. Got a fever? Perhaps you should drink water that a blacksmith has used to cool his hot iron. Suffering from the falling sickness, what we'd call epilepsy. Maybe try consuming a powder made from the skull of a hanged man. Because why not double down on the tragedy? The line between pharmacy and dark superstition was blurry at best. So Eleanor, our hypothetical lady, would spend hours here, not just making soap, but compounding these remedies. She'd be crushing dried leaves with a mortar and pestle. The rhythmic thump, 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 a constant soundtrack to the room. She'd be straining infusions through fine cloth. She'd be carefully labeling little clay pots and glass vials with their contents and uses. For the ague, for the green sickness, for pains in the joints. It was a responsibility. Someone got sick. It was on her knowledge, or lack thereof. No wonder they buried so many of the instructions in ritual. It must have been terrifying to be the one person everyone looked to when the plague cart rolled by. The still room was also about preservation and pleasure. This is where you'd make cordials. Not the sweet, fruity things we think of today, but strong, herbal spirits originally made for their medicinal qualities. You'd distill wine with herbs like anise, caraway, or juniper to create aqua vita, the water of life. It was believed to revive the spirits, to aid digestion, to get you pleasantly drunk, which can feel a lot like medicine. This is also where you'd make fruit preserves, candying ginger and orange peel in precious sugar, or storing summer berries in honey. It was a way to capture a fleeting season in a jar, to have a taste of summer in the deep, dark dead of winter. A small, sweet defiance against the relentless march of time and decay. So, as the day wears on, in our quiet still room, the light begins to fade. The great vats of soap have been poured into their frames. The newly made candles dipped over and over again until they were thick enough, hang in rows to set. The bunches of herbs rustle softly in the drafts that whisper through the stone walls. Eleanor might take a moment to just sit, to wipe her hands on her apron, hands that are probably chapped and raw from lye and water and work. She might look over her shelves, stocked with the fruits of her labor. The jars of salve, the bottles of cordial, the blocks of coarse, brown soap. There's no glory in this. No chronicler will write about the day she made a particularly effective batch of soap. No bard will sing of her perfectly preserved quinces. But this was the foundation. All the politics, all the wars, all the grand dramas of kings and popes. They were built on top of this, on the mundane, repetitive, absolutely essential work of keeping people clean, fed, and moderately healthy. It was a life of quiet competence, a life of recipes handed down from mother to daughter, of small failures and small triumphs. The history that never gets written, but without which there would be no history to write at all. And as the last of the light disappears, and a servant comes in to bank the fires for the night, the still room falls into a profound silence. The work is done for now. Tomorrow it will begin again. Thanks for watching.
So, we've left the still room for the evening. The soap is setting, the herbs are sleeping, and Eleanor has presumably gone to enjoy a well-earned rest, probably dreaming of more efficient leaching troughs. But the work of a medieval household, much like history itself, rarely pauses for long. It just shifts focus. With the soap made, another essential and equally tedious task would soon demand attention. One that fought back the literal, not just metaphorical, darkness. We're talking about candles. Because when the sun went down in the medieval world, which it did with monotonous regularity, you had basically three options: go to sleep, stumble around in the dark, or have a lot of candles. And of course, you couldn't just buy a pack of vanilla-scented pillars from a home goods store. You had to make them. All of them. This was another one of those quarterly, all-hands-on-deck chores that everyone probably complained about in hushed tones. The candle-making day. Now, not all candles were created equal. This was a society built on hierarchy, and the hierarchy extended right down to the source of your light. At the top of the candle social ladder was beeswax. Beeswax candles were the aristocracy of illumination. They burned cleanly, with a bright, steady flame and a faint, sweet smell of honey. They were expensive because beekeeping was a delicate art, and a single hive didn't produce that much wax in a year. Beeswax candles were reserved for the church because God, apparently, preferred non-smelly light, and for the very richest nobles in their grandest halls. Lighting a beeswax candle was a statement. It said, "I am so wealthy, I can burn the equivalent of a small jar of honey just to read a book." Then, down at the bottom, you had the commoners, the proletariat of the lighting world. Tallow candles. Tallow, as we remember from our soap adventure, is rendered animal fat, usually sheep or cow fat. And if you thought it smelled bad when it was being rendered for soap, wait until you burn it. A tallow candle gave off a faint, guttering, yellowish light. And it smoked. It smoked a lot. A thin, greasy, black smoke that coated ceilings, walls, and lungs in a fine layer of soot. And the smell. The smell was like cooking a cheap joint of meat in a room with no ventilation forever. It was the smell of peasant homes, of drafty castle corridors, of servants' quarters. It was, in essence, the smell of most of the Middle Ages after sunset. So, back to Our Lady, Eleanor. Let's imagine it's the day after the soap making. She's had a night's rest, her hands still tingling slightly from the lye. But there's no time to waste. The tallow, rendered and stored from the last butchering, is brought out. It's been kept cool, so it's a solid, waxy, off-white block. It has to be gently remelted. Not boiled, just melted. Because you have to work with it while it's liquid. The process itself was called dipping. It was hypnotic in its monotony. You'd have a large, hot vat of melted tallow. And then you'd have a series of wicks, usually made of twisted linen or hemp, hanging from a rod. A worker, or more likely, several workers, would take the rod, dip all the wicks into the tallow, pull them out, let the thin layer cool and harden for a moment, and then dip them again, and again, and again. Each dip added another thin layer of fat to the wick. Slowly, painstakingly, the candles would fatten up, from a string, to a skinny taper, to a respectable, if homely, candle. It could take dozens of dips to make a single candle of usable thickness. It was a test of patience, a slow, rhythmic, almost meditative torture. Dip, lift, wait. Dip, lift, wait. The room would be even warmer and smell even more strongly of cooking fat. The workers would be standing there for hours, their arms aching, their minds numb, performing the same tiny, precise motion over and over. It was the medieval equivalent of data entry, but with more grease. And the quality control was rudimentary. If you dipped too quickly, the hot tallow would melt the previous layer and you'd make no progress. If you let the tallow get too cool, it would coat too thickly and create lumpy, misshapen candles that would burn unevenly. The goal was a smooth, even taper. It was a skill born of pure repetition. There was no art to it, only muscle memory and a resigned acceptance of your fate. Now, beeswax candles were a different matter. They weren't usually dipped. They were rolled. Sheets of pure beeswax would be softened slightly by the warmth of the hands, and then carefully, lovingly, rolled around a wick. It was a cleaner, quieter, more dignified process. It probably happened in a different, less greasy part of the still room. The tallow dippers would look over at the beeswax roller with a kind of weary resentment. She got to work with a nice-smelling, clean material, while they stood ankle-deep in the aesthetic of a butcher shop. But the humble tallow candle had its own, quiet impact on daily life. Its poor quality dictated the rhythm of the evening. Its light was too weak for fine work like embroidery or reading for long periods. Its smoke and smell were unpleasant. So, after the evening meal, most activity would wind down. People would gather around the single best light source, the hearth fire, and talk, or sing, or do simple chores like mending that didn't require great eyesight. The poor candle, in its own sad, smelly way, enforced a kind of collective rest. It made the night a time for storytelling, for gossip, for quiet contemplation, because trying to do anything more ambitious by tallow light was just not worth the headache. And of course, there were other options. Rush lights were even more basic. You'd take the pithy core of a rush plant, dip it in grease or fat, and hold it in a special clamp. It would burn for maybe 15, 20 minutes. A cheap, disposable light for getting from the hall to your bedchamber, or for a servant who needed to check on something quickly. It was the medieval version of a flashlight with dying batteries. So, as another day draws to a close in our manor, the new candles are finished. Rows of tallow dips hang like pale, fleshy fingers from their rods, cooling completely before being stored in the cool, dry darkness of a storeroom. The beeswax candles, smooth and golden, are laid carefully in a chest, reserved for special occasions that may never come. Eleanor surveys the day's work. Hundreds of candles, each one representing a dozen tiny, repetitive actions. Enough light to see the household through the next few months. It's not a glorious sight. It's not a chest full of gold or a new tapestry. It's just infrastructure. The unspoken, uncelebrated groundwork that allowed for the possibility of everything else. The light by which treaties would be read, love letters written, and conspiratorial whispers exchanged. All made possible by a day spent dipping strings into vats of hot animal fat. It makes you think. We always imagine the past in its grand moments, the coronations, the battles, the dramatic speeches. But for every one of those moments, there were thousands of hours spent like this. In quiet, smoky rooms, doing the boring, smelly, absolutely vital work that held the world together, one dip of a candle at a time. And with the light taken care of, the household could turn its attention to another fundamental, never-ending task, the one that involved an awful lot of salt, and the patient, slow decay of time itself. But that is a story for another quiet moment. So the soap is made. The candles are dipped. The manor has the means to be clean and illuminated, at least by the modest standards of the age. But another, more persistent shadow loomed over the medieval household, one that required a different kind of alchemy to keep at bay. The shadow of hunger, not the dramatic famine of song and story, but the slow, creeping hunger of a long winter, a failed crop, a stretch of muddy roads that made travel and trade impossible. This was the problem of preservation, the relentless march of decay, because in a world without refrigeration, without canning, without freeze-drying, food went bad. It went bad quickly, and with a depressing lack of ceremony. So a huge part of the quiet work of the still room, and the kitchens, and the outbuildings, was a constant, slow-motion battle against rot. A battle fought with three main weapons: salt, smoke, and sugar. Let's drift back to our manor. Eleanor is now turning her attention to the autumn slaughter. Because, of course, you didn't just keep a herd of cattle through the winter. That would require feeding them, housing them, tending to them while the world was frozen and feed was scarce. So, as the days grew shorter and the air took on a sharp, metallic bite, a grim practicality set in. Most of the animals that wouldn't be used for breeding or milk were slaughtered. This created a sudden, overwhelming surplus of meat, a problem that needed to be solved immediately. And so, the air around the manor would change again. The comforting smells of herbs and beeswax would be joined, and then overpowered, by the pungent, acrid scent of wood smoke, and the sharp, throat-catching tang of salt. The most common method, the workhorse of preservation, was salting. This wasn't a light sprinkling. This was a brutal, desiccating process. Great chunks of meat, usually pork or beef, were packed into barrels with staggering quantities of salt. They were buried in it. The salt would draw the moisture out of the meat, creating an environment where the bacteria that caused rot simply couldn't survive. It was a simple, effective, and utterly destructive process. The result was a substance that was technically meat, but had the texture and culinary appeal of a salted leather shoe. Before it went into the barrel, the meat might also be soaked in a brine, a heavily salted water solution. This helped distribute the salt more evenly. Testing the brine was another one of those homely skills. The classic test was to see if a fresh egg would float in it. If the egg sank, you needed more salt. It was a world built on these little, practical tests. No thermometers, no hydrometers. Just an egg, bobbing in a vat of salty water, determining whether your family would have edible food in February. Then there was the smoking. Meat, and especially fish, would be hung in a specially built smokehouse. A slow, cool fire of specific woods, oak, apple, hickory, would be kept smoldering for days, sometimes weeks. The smoke would curl and weave around the hanging carcasses, imparting a flavor and, more importantly, depositing a layer of chemicals on the surface that acted as a preservative and an antimicrobial agent. The meat would take on a dark, rich, mahogany color. It would become hard and dry. It was essentially mummified. Imagine the taste. You'd have this piece of meat, already desiccated by salt, now infused with the flavor of a perpetual campfire. To eat it, you'd have to soak it for hours, sometimes days, in multiple changes of water, just to make it soft enough to chew and to leach out enough salt to make it palatable. Then you'd boil it, usually with whatever hearty vegetables you had stored away in a root cellar: turnips, cabbages, onions. The result was a stew that was functional. It was calories. It was sustenance. It was a long, long way from a perfectly seared steak. And of course, the irony was pervasive. The entire process of preservation was about saving life, staving off starvation, but it was steeped in the imagery of death. The salt drew out the moisture, leaving the meat a stiff, dry simulacrum of its living self. The smoke turned it the color of old wood and earth. It was a constant, gentle reminder of mortality, hanging in the larder. a reminder that life was a fleeting thing, and that survival often meant embracing things that were, for all intents and purposes, already dead. But it wasn't all salted leather and smoked mummies. The still room had its sweeter victories, too. This is where the precious, expensive sugar came into play. While salt preserved through dehydration, sugar preserved through saturation. Fruit, which would rot in a matter of days, could be captured in time if you cooked it with enough sugar to create an environment where microbial life couldn't thrive. They made preserves, jams, and pastes. Quince paste, a thick, sweet jelly, was a particular favorite. They candied ginger and citrus peels, boiling them repeatedly in sugar syrups until they became translucent and shelf-stable. This was luxury. This was alchemy of a higher order, turning fragile, ephemeral fruit into a stable, sweet treat that could be enjoyed months later. It was a tiny defiance, a small, sweet monument to summer, stored in a jar in the dark. Of course, only the wealthy could afford to do this on any significant scale. Sugar was an imported spice, incredibly expensive. For most people, the only sweet preservative was honey, and that was valuable in its own right. And then there was brewing, another quiet, slow, and absolutely essential process that fell under the lady of the house's purview. Brewing beer. Not the hoppy, craft IPAs of today, but small beer, a low-alcohol, lightly fermented beverage that was the daily drink of almost everyone, including children. The water was often unsafe to drink, but the process of brewing, boiling the water and fermenting it, killed the pathogens. Small beer was hydrating, slightly nutritious, and much safer than water. So another day in the still room might see a different kind of steam. The steam from a great mash tun, where malted barley was steeped in hot water to extract the sugars. The sweet, grainy smell of wort filling the air. Then the liquid would be transferred to barrels, yeast would be added, and the slow, silent work of fermentation would begin. It was a less hands-on process than soap or candles, but it required a different kind of attention, a watchful waiting, a knowledge of temperatures and timings that was, like so much else, passed down through practice and failure. So, as the autumn deepened, the manor larders and storerooms would gradually fill up. Barrels of salted beef and pork, bunches of smoked herring and eels, jars of fruit preserves, barrels of small beer and stronger ale, sacks of grain milled into flour, root vegetables packed in sand in the cellar. It was a form of wealth that never made it into tax records or royal inventories. But it was more real, more immediate, than a chest of silver coins. This was security. This was the buffer between a comfortable winter and a desperate one. All of it, the result of days and weeks of quiet, unglamorous, repetitive labor. The patient science of salt and smoke. A science without textbooks, without famous pioneers. A science practiced by countless Eleanors in countless still rooms, whose only monument was the simple, profound fact that their households made it through to the spring. And with the larders full and the candles ready, the household could finally turn its attention inward, to the comforts of cloth and thread, to the slow, meticulous work of the needle. But that is a story of its own. A story of tapestries not as art, but as insulation, of embroidery as a pastime, and a prison, with the larders stocked and the preservatives working their slow, silent magic. The medieval household could, in theory, breathe a sigh of relief. The most pressing threats of hunger and darkness had been held at bay for a time. But the coming of the colder months, the long, dark nights enforced by those smelly tallow candles, brought with them a different kind of labor, one that was less physically demanding than rendering fat or hauling ash, but in its own way, more relentless. It was the work of the needle, the endless, patient, eye-straining tyranny of cloth. Because, like soap and candles, you couldn't just go out and buy a new tunic, or a blanket, or a set of sheets for the bed. Every single piece of cloth in the manor, from the lord's finest embroidered doublet to the rough sacking used to store grain, had to be made by hand, from scratch. The production of textiles was the single most time-consuming domestic task for women of all classes. It was a life sentence of spinning, weaving, cutting, and sewing. So let's drift back to Eleanor's world. The first frost has settled on the ground outside, a brittle, white crust that crackles underfoot. Inside, the great hall is a little more crowded, a little more lived in. The household has retreated from the fields and yards. And in the corner, near the light of a window or the warmth of the hearth, the women gather. This is where the real, quiet engine of the medieval economy hums along. The distaff and the spindle. Spinning is the foundation of it all. The taking of raw, fluffy fleece or plant fibers like flax and drawing them out, twisting them into a continuous, strong thread. It was done with a drop spindle, a simple weighted rod that you'd set spinning and then just feed the fibers into. It was a motion so fundamental that the very word spinster entered the language to describe an unmarried woman, one who would likely spend her entire life at this task. It was a skill little girls learned almost as soon as their fingers were coordinated enough to hold the wool. The rhythm of it was hypnotic. Pull, twist, wind. Pull, twist, wind. For hours. A good spinner could produce a remarkable amount of thread in a day, but it was never enough. It was never ever enough. Because to make enough thread for a single sheet of cloth, you needed miles of it. Literally. The work was constant, and it was portable. You could do it while watching children, while listening to a reading, while waiting for a meal. Your hands were never truly idle. There was always more wool to spin. And the materials themselves were uncompromising. Wool straight from the sheep was greasy, filled with lanolin and bits of vegetation, what was charmingly called tags. It had to be washed, carded, brushed with spiky paddles to align the fibers, and then it was ready. Flax, for linen, was worse. The process of turning the flax plant into spinnable fiber involved letting it rot slightly in water, a process called retting, which produced a smell so uniquely foul it was legendary. Then it was beaten and scraped and combed. The resulting linen thread was strong and smooth, but getting to that point was an ordeal. Once you had your thread, the real magic could begin. Weaving. This was a slightly more specialized task, often done on a large loom that required standing and a bit more space. The loom was a complex wooden frame, a maze of vertical threads called the warp. The weaver would then pass a shuttle, carrying the horizontal weft thread, back and forth, through the warp. With each pass, a bar called the beater would be pulled forward to pack the new thread tightly against the ones before it. Clack, swish, thump. Clack, swish, thump. That was the sound of cloth being born. It was a slower sound than you might think. A skilled weaver was a valuable asset, but even she could only produce a few yards of cloth in a long day. And this was just plain, undyed, homespun cloth, the kind that made up most of the clothing for most of the people. It was rough. It was itchy. It was the medieval equivalent of burlap. Wearing it against your skin was a constant, low-grade annoyance, a lifelong negotiation with discomfort. But of course, for the elite, this would not do. This is where Eleanor's role shifted from manager of basic production to overseer of luxury. This is where the still room's knowledge of plants met the world of aesthetics. Dyeing, creating color, was another form of alchemy. You had your vats again, but this time, they weren't for soap or tallow. They were filled with simmering, colorful liquids, steeped with the strange ingredients of the natural world. Want a rich, regal purple? Well, you couldn't. Unless you were the emperor. Because true purple came from a specific sea snail, the murex, and it was so ludicrously expensive it was literally worth more than its weight in gold. So that was out. But there were other options. A vibrant red could be coaxed from the madder root, a plant cultivated for this purpose. A sunny yellow came from weld, or sometimes from saffron, though that was also extravagantly pricey. A deep blue came from woad, a plant that had to be fermented in urine to release its color, a process that, as you can imagine, added another layer of fragrance to the household air. Green was tricky. You often had to dye the cloth first with woad for blue, and then overdye it with weld for yellow. The results were variable. The dyed thread was then used for embroidery. This was the pinnacle of the needlewoman's art. This was where Eleanor and her ladies would spend their winter hours, taking a piece of plain, imported linen or fine wool, and covering it with intricate designs in silk thread. Silk, another impossibly expensive import, the height of luxury. They'd embroider biblical scenes, mythical beasts, heraldic symbols. They'd create altar cloths for the church, or lavish wall hangings that served a dual purpose. They were displays of wealth and status, and they acted as insulation, blocking drafts from the cold stone walls. This work was done in a specific style called opus Anglicanum, English work, which was famous across Europe. It was exquisite. It was also, undoubtedly, torturous on the eyes and the back. Hunched over a frame for hours on end, squinting by the poor light, pushing a fine needle through thick cloth. It was a kind of beautiful, sanctioned suffering. The product was a masterpiece, but the process was a marathon of tedium and physical strain. And this was the great, quiet contradiction of a noblewoman's life. She was the lady of the manor, a figure of authority. She could manage vast estates in her husband's absence, dispense justice, oversee a small army of servants. Yet, for a significant portion of her day, she was expected to sit still and perform this minute, repetitive, physically punishing task. Her value was tied to her ability to produce both heirs and embroidery. One was a biological function, the other a social one. Both were, in their way, forms of labor expected of her station. So, as winter truly sets in, the scene in the hall becomes a study in contrasts. The lord, if he's home, might be practicing with his weapons, or reading, or managing accounts. His movements are large, his domain the wide world. The women, gathered around the fire, are a picture of intense, contained focus. Their world is the space of an embroidery hoop. Their battles are fought with a needle, their victories measured in the perfection of a stitch. It's easy to romanticize it. The quiet ladies, creating beauty by the fireside. But the reality was probably a lot of sore necks, pricked fingers, and the slow, creeping boredom of a task that could never be finished. There was always another hole to darn, another shirt to sew, another tapestry to complete. It was a life measured out not in coffee spoons, but in spools of thread. A slow, quiet, endless making. And in that making, the very fabric of their world was held together. We've covered the making of things. The soap, the light, the food, the cloth. All of it quiet, patient work that built the physical world of the manor. But there was another, more fragile kind of production happening in the background. One that was, in many ways, the most important of all. The production of heirs. The raising of children. And this was a world of quiet desperation, of strange rituals, and of a great, looming silence. Because childhood, as we conceive of it today, a protected, cherished, innocent space, was a concept that would have been utterly alien to the medieval mind. A child was a small, potentially useful, and terrifyingly fragile asset. A little bundle of germs in need that had to be guided, with grim determination, towards the single goal of survival. Survival to adulthood was not a given. It was a minor miracle. So let's drift now, away from the still room and the great hall, and towards the nursery. A room that was likely not a dedicated nursery at all, but perhaps a smaller, slightly warmer chamber near the parents' quarters. Here we find Eleanor again, but this time, not as a manager of household logistics. She is a mother, and her primary emotion, if the historical record is any guide, was probably a low, constant hum of anxiety. The journey began with birth, which was its own private battlefield. It was the domain of women, midwives and female relatives, while men waited elsewhere, presumably looking concerned or, more likely, just getting on with their day. The mortality rate for both mother and child was so high that childbirth was less a celebration and more a grim dice roll. The mother would be prepared for her possible death, receiving last rites as a matter of course. It was that level of risk. If both mother and child survived the ordeal, the rituals began immediately. The first was swaddling. The newborn would be washed, often in wine, which was believed to strengthen the skin. Then, its limbs would be straightened and wrapped tightly, from shoulders to feet, in long, narrow bands of linen. It looked a bit like making a tiny baby mummy. The theory behind swaddling was that it would ensure the baby's limbs grew straight and strong, and that it would prevent the infant from startling itself awake with its own random movements. There was probably also a more practical, unspoken reason. A swaddled baby is a contained baby. It can't crawl into trouble. It can be propped up in a corner or hung from a peg on the wall, out of the way, which they did. There are illustrations of swaddled infants hung from pegs on the wall like little luggage. Because why not? It kept them safe from rats and drafts. It was a different time. The swaddling would be changed periodically, but the baby would spend most of its first few months of life in this tight cloth prison. It seems cruel to our modern sensibilities, but it was just standard practice. One of those things everyone did because everyone did it. Then came the question of feeding. For a noblewoman like Eleanor, breastfeeding was often seen as common. Beneath her station, it was also believed that the mother's milk could be corrupted by her emotions. A fit of passion or a moment of melancholy could sour the milk and make the child sickly. So, the task was frequently outsourced to a wet nurse. The wet nurse was a carefully selected woman, usually from a local village, who had recently given birth and had milk to spare. Her own child was often weaned early, or even well. The outcomes for that child were statistically not great. The noble baby took precedence. The wet nurse would be brought into the household, her character and physical health scrutinized. It was believed her temperament would be passed to the child through her milk. So you wanted a calm, sturdy, morally upright woman. Because why not double down on the psychological pressure? This created a strange, intimate, and fundamentally transactional relationship. The wet nurse was performing the most primal act of motherhood for a child that was not her own, while her own child was possibly being fed by a goat or given pap, a bland, watery mixture of bread and milk. The noble child would bond with this woman, only to have her vanish from its life once it was weaned. It was a system built on a kind of quiet, accepted trauma for everyone involved. And the children themselves, they were dressed as miniature adults. As soon as they were out of swaddling clothes, a noble boy would be put into a tiny doublet and hose, a little girl into a miniature version of her mother's gown and wimple. There were no onesies, no comfortable, practical play clothes. They were little monuments to their family status from the moment they could walk. Their toys were simple and often reflected the world they were born into. A little girl might have a doll. A boy might have a wooden sword or a hobby horse. But play, as an unstructured, imaginative escape, wasn't really the point. Childhood was an apprenticeship for adulthood, and it began almost immediately. For a noble boy, by the age of 7, he would be sent away. This was the custom, known as fostering. He would be sent to the household of another noble, often a relative or a more powerful lord, to begin his training as a knight and a courtier. He would serve as a page, learning manners, weaponry, and the complex rules of chivalry. He wouldn't see his family for years. The emotional wrench of this was simply not discussed. It was what was done. His value was as a future knight, a political asset, not as a son. A noble girl, on the other hand, stayed home, but her education was just as focused and just as bleak. She learned to run a household. She learned to spin, to weave, to embroider. She learned her manners, her prayers, and how to be silent. Her value was as a future wife, a vessel for carrying a bloodline into another family. She was taught to be obedient, to be devout, and to hope that her future husband, whom she may not meet until the wedding day, was not a violent drunk. And through it all, the silence of high infant mortality. It was not uncommon for a family to have 10 children and see only 2 or 3 survive to adulthood. The loss of a child was a sorrow, of course, but it was a common sorrow, a expected sorrow. Grief was tempered by a grim, statistical realism. You didn't name a child until it had survived its first few precarious weeks, because it was easier to lose a nameless child. They were often given the same name as a dead sibling, the name reused, as if trying to slot a new soul into an old, pre-made space. So the sound of the nursery was not one of giggles and lullabies. It was the sound of a swaddled baby, immobilized and quiet, the sound of a wet nurse's humming, the sound of a mother's anxious prayers. It was a world of tiny, constrained lives, guided by superstition and necessity towards a future they had no say in. Their stories, for the most part, are the stories that never got written. The silent, swaddled heart of the medieval home. A heart that beat softly, nervously, under layers of linen and expectation. We've wandered through the rooms of production, the still room's steam, the candlemaker's grease, the weaver's clacking loom, the nursery's swaddled silence. But all of this quiet, constant work required a conductor, a central intelligence that knew where the saffron was stored, how much barley was left, when the last of the salted pork should be rotated, and which tenant farmer was late on his payment of chickens. This intelligence, more often than not, was the lady of the manor, and her symbol of office, her scepter, was not a jeweled rod, but a heavy iron ring laden with keys. So let's follow Eleanor one more time, not as a soap maker or a mother, but as an administrator. The sun is up, gray and weak through the winter mist. She has finished her morning prayers, and now the keys are in her hand. This is the daily round, the walk that signified her authority over the inner workings of the castle. The first stop is almost always the still room itself. She checks the supplies, runs a finger over the shelves of dried herbs, feeling for moisture, sniffs at a jar of camphor salve to see if it has turned. She consults with the cook about the day's meals, a discussion that was less about recipes and more about inventory management. How much of the salted beef should they use? Is the barley in the granary holding out, or is it beginning to show signs of damp? Should they slaughter another chicken, or can they make do with eggs and pottage? These were the high-stakes decisions of the day. Then she'd go to the storerooms. This is where the keys came into their own. A heavy, rasping turn in a lock, and the door to the spice cupboard would open. This was the castle's vault, more valuable than gold in many ways. Here in small, carefully labeled wooden boxes were the spices: pepper, cinnamon, cloves, ginger, saffron, which was worth its weight in gold. These were not just flavorings, they were status, they were medicine, they were a form of currency. She would measure out what was needed for the day, her hands practiced and precise. A pinch of this, a dram of that. Waste was not an option. Next, the linen press. Another lock, another key. Here, the household's wealth was displayed in cloth. The stacks of sheets, the tablecloths, the fine napkins. All of it counted, all of it inspected for wear, for moth damage, for stains. She might direct one of her maidens to darn a small tear in a sheet, or set aside a yellowing tablecloth to be bleached in the sun come spring. It was a tedious, meticulous accounting of domestic capital. And then there were the people. The household was not just a family. It was a small village under one roof. There were knights and men-at-arms, chaplains, scribes, grooms, huntsmen, cooks, scullions, dairy maids, and countless other servants. All of them were her responsibility. Their disputes, their illnesses, their minor transgressions, all came to her. So, after her walk, she would often hold a kind of informal court. She'd sit in the great hall, and the grievances would be brought forward. The brewer complaining that the stable boy had stolen a jug of ale. A dairy maid in tears because another servant was spreading rumors about her. Two grooms who had come to blows over whose turn it was to muck out the stalls. Her job was to adjudicate, to listen with a patient ear and dispense a practical, usually non-lethal, form of justice. A deduction from wages, an extra chore, a stern talking to. It required a knowledge of human nature, a sense of fairness, and a great deal of patience. Because the pettiness was endless. The medieval household was a pressure cooker of proximity, and the steam had to be let out somewhere. And of course, there was the constant, low-grade accounting. While the lord managed the macroeconomy of the estate, the rents, the taxes, the feudal obligations, the lady managed the microeconomy. She knew to the penny, or rather, to the denier, what was spent on wax, on thread, on repairing a cart, on alms for the poor. She kept the records, often in a neat, precise hand. It was bureaucracy of the most mundane kind, the kind that never makes it into songs, but without which the songs couldn't be sung. The irony of her position was profound. She held immense practical power. She was, in her husband's absence, the absolute ruler of the domestic sphere, which was the foundation of everything. Yet legally, she was a femme covered, a woman covered, subsumed by her husband's legal identity. She couldn't sue or be sued in her own name. She couldn't own property. Her entire existence was one of delegated authority. She wielded the keys, but she didn't own the locks. This is the quiet, grinding reality of a noblewoman's life. It wasn't all embroidery and piety. It was logistics. It was conflict resolution. It was inventory management. It was being the calm, unflappable center of a perpetual storm of need and complaint. Her life was a series of lists. Lists of supplies to order, lists of repairs to be made, lists of guests to accommodate, lists of sins to confess. So as the day draws to a close, and Eleanor finally returns the heavy ring of keys to its place, her work is not really done. It's just paused. Tomorrow, the lock on the spice cupboard will need to turn again. The brewer and the stable boy will find something new to argue about. Another sack of flour will be emptied. Another candle will burn down to a stump. This is the history that surrounds the grand events, the quiet, administrative hum that underpins the reigns of kings and the outcomes of wars. While a king was worrying about the succession of a throne, 1,000 Eleanors were worrying about the succession of the salt supply. Their chronicles were not written on parchment, but in the well-stocked larders, the clean linen, and the grudging peace that held a household together for one more day. A small, quiet victory against the relentless tide of entropy. A victory won not with a sword, but with a heavy set of keys. We have followed the lady of the manor, Eleanor, with her ring of keys. We've lingered in the still room, the nursery, the storerooms. We've traced the lines of her authority, the quiet burden of her management. But for every Eleanor, there were dozens of others whose lives were even quieter, whose stories a little more than footnotes in account books. The servants, the ones who did the actual hauling, the scrubbing, the waking before dawn, and the collapsing after dark. Their history is written not in chronicles, but in the weariness of bones and the silence of exhaustion. So let's drift down now, away from the Lady Solar, down the spiral staircase, into the undercroft of the castle. The air changes. It gets colder, damper. The light from the narrow windows is thinner, and it smells less of herbs and beeswax and more of damp stone, cold earth, and unwashed bodies. This is where the engine of the household really lived. The people who made the machine run. Their day began not with a prayer, but with a chill. Long before the lord and lady stirred in their curtained beds, a scullion, the lowest of the low in the kitchen hierarchy, would be stumbling through the pre-dawn gloom to the well. His hands, already chapped and raw from lye and cold water, would haul up the heavy buckets. His first task was to rekindle the kitchen fires from the banked embers of the night before, blowing on them, coaxing a flame, feeding it with kindling. It was a fundamental, vital act. No fire meant no breakfast, no hot water, no warmth. The pressure was immense, and the consequence of failure was likely a beating. Then the others would arrive. The kitchen boys, the turnspits, the dairy maids. Their world was one of relentless, repetitive motion. A kitchen maid might spend her entire morning doing nothing but chopping onions or leeks for the massive cauldron of pottage that would simmer all day. Her eyes would stream. Her fingers would be stained. The turnspit boy, often a young child, would be condemned to his wheel, walking endlessly to rotate a heavy joint of meat over the fire, his face blistering from the heat, his world reduced to the few feet of his circular prison. They were known not by their names in the records, but by their functions. The knave who tends the geese, the maid from the dairy, the scullion. They were human appliances. Their comfort was an afterthought, their fatigue irrelevant. A servant who fell ill was a problem of logistics, not of compassion. Could they still work? If not, they were moved out of the way, and someone else had to pick up their duties, and their lives were lived in a state of perpetual auditory assault. The kitchen was a cacophony of clanging pots, hissing steam, and shouted orders. The great hall, during mealtimes, was a roar of conversation, barking dogs, and minstrels trying to be heard over the din. There was no silence, no privacy, no solitude. The only quiet they likely ever experienced was the dead of night, when they collapsed onto their straw-filled pallets in the communal sleeping quarters, too tired to even talk. Their diet was a study in monotony. While the lord and lady dined on spiced meats and white bread, the servants ate the pottage, a thick, grain-based stew, and coarse, dark bread made from rye or barley. They might get a piece of the cheaper, salter fish on a fast day, or the offcuts of meat that weren't fit for the high table. They drank small beer, constantly. It was hydration, nutrition, and a slight numbing agent against the drudgery of the day. The social world of servants was a complex, unwritten hierarchy of its own. The steward, who managed the entire household in the Lord's name, was at the top, a figure of immense authority. Then the chaplain, the scribe. Then the specialized craftsman, the smith, the carpenter. Then the cooks and the personal attendants to the lord and lady. Then the grooms and the huntsmen. And then, at the very bottom, the general laborers, the scullions, the ones who cleaned the privies. There were alliances and enmities, romances and bitter rivalries, all playing out in the cramped, tense environment below stairs. A misplaced glance, a rumor whispered, could mean you got the worst chores for a week. Their connection to the world outside was also one of labor. A dairymaid's life was dictated by the needs of the cows, up before the sun to milk them, then spending the day in the cool dairy house, skimming cream, churning butter, making cheese. Her world smelled of sour milk and damp stone. Her hands were permanently cold. A groom's life was the smell of hay and horse sweat, of manure and leather. His body was a collection of aches from mucking out stalls, lifting saddles, and being kicked. They saw the seasons change not as a beautiful cycle, but as a series of different kinds of work. The hay harvest, the slaughter, the plowing, the shearing. And what of their inner lives? Their hopes, their fears? History is almost entirely silent on the matter. They likely dreamed of small improvements, of becoming a cook instead of a scullion, of marrying another servant and maybe, one day, having a cottage of their own on the estate. Their ambitions were necessarily small, contained by the walls of the world they knew. Their faith was probably a simple, desperate one. Prayers for a good harvest, for protection from illness, for a kind master. Their pleasures were few and fleeting. A stolen kiss in a stable, an extra cup of ale on a feast day, a few hours of rest on a Sunday. They lived and died without fanfare. When a servant died, they were buried in the churchyard with a simple marker, if they were lucky. Their name was quickly forgotten, their position filled by another body. They were the true cogs in the machine, the unseen, the unheard. So as we picture the medieval manor in all its complexity, we have to remember this silent, moving parts. The girl hauling water, her back aching. The boy turning the spit, his mind numb. The old woman scrubbing floors on her hands and knees. They never held a key. They never tasted saffron. They never wore silk. But without their constant, quiet, exhausting labor, the world of Eleanor, with her still room and her embroidery, would have simply ground to a halt. They were the foundation under the foundation, the deep, silent earth upon which everything else was built. And their story is the quietest of them all. We have spent a quiet, meandering while in this manor. We've seen the steam of the still room and the smoke of the hearth, felt the weight of the keys and the ache of the spindle. We've watched the slow, patient battle against rot and darkness, and the even slower shaping of small, swaddled humans into their predetermined roles. It is easy, after all this, to see the medieval household as a place of stagnation, a slow, grinding wheel of repetitive labor going nowhere. But that would be missing the point entirely. The household wasn't stagnant. It was a perpetual motion machine. Its purpose wasn't progress, in our modern sense of moving forward towards something new. Its purpose was continuance. Its entire reason for being was to take the form it had been given, the social order, the family line, the estate itself, and replicate it, exactly, into the next day, the next season, the next generation. It was a machine for the preservation of the status quo. And in that, it was brilliantly, monotonously effective. Think of the rhythms we've observed. They are all cyclical, not linear. The soap is made, used, and then more ash is collected to make more soap. The candles are dipped, burned down to nothing, and then more tallow is rendered to dip more candles. The meat is salted in autumn, eaten through the winter, and the cycle begins again with the next autumn slaughter. The children are raised to take the places of their parents, who took the places of theirs. It was a closed loop, a beautifully efficient, utterly exhausting Ouroboros of need and fulfillment. And at the center of this loop was not a person, but a principle, the principle of stewardship. The Lord was a steward of his land and his people, answerable to God and his king. The lady was a steward of his household, its resources, and its future. Even the lowliest scullion was a steward of his specific, tiny task: the fire, the water, the scrubbing of a pot. It was a worldview that prized maintenance over innovation, continuity over change. A broken wall was to be repaired, not reimagined. A torn tunic was to be mended, not replaced with a new fashion. This is why the still room is such a perfect metaphor for it all. Nothing created that was truly new. Every salve was a preparation of known herbs, mixed in a known way, for a known ill. Every potion was a recipe from a leech book copied from another leech book, which was copied from one before that. The goal was not discovery. The goal was correct replication. To make this year's lavender cordial taste exactly like last year's. To ensure the soap had the same reliable, mediocre effectiveness. Innovation was risk. And risk, in a world balanced on a knife's edge of survival, was folly. So the days bled together. One candlelit evening was much like the last. One season of salting and smoking mirrored the one before. The Lord might go off to war, or to court, and bring back stories of new things. But the manor itself would absorb those stories, digest them, and then carry on with its essential, unchanging work. A new tapestry on the wall didn't change the need to darn socks. A report of a new philosophy from Paris didn't make the barley grow any faster. And the people within this machine, they knew their orbits. The frustration of the servant, the weariness of the lady, the dull resolve of the Lord. These were not signs of a system failing. They were the sounds of the machine operating as designed, the creaks and groans of a mill wheel turning, day after day, season after season. Their personal desires, their secret hopes for something different, were like dust in the gears. Annoying, perhaps, but ultimately ground down to nothing by the relentless, turning weight of duty and routine. This is the profound, quiet truth of everyday history. The grand narratives of kings and popes, of treaties and invasions, are just the froth on the surface. The deep, powerful current underneath is this: the need to eat, to stay warm, to produce children, and to teach those children how to do the same. It is a story with no climax, because the climax would be the end of the cycle. It is a story with no villain, because the villain would be entropy itself, the cold, the rot, the silence, and it is a fight that is never won, only temporarily held at bay. So, as our time in this manor draws to a close, let's take one last, slow look around. It is evening. The last of the tallow candles are guttering in the great hall, casting long, dancing shadows. The servants have retired to their pallets. The children are asleep, swaddled or not. Eleanor has put her keys away for the night. In the still room, the last embers in the hearth glow faintly beneath the great, empty soap cauldron. The bunches of herbs hang like sleeping bats in the rafters. The room is still. It is quiet, but it is awaiting quiet, because tomorrow, just before dawn, a scullion will enter. He will blow on those embers. He will fill the cauldron with water, and the cycle will begin again, not with a bang, or a fanfare, or a historic declaration, but with a faint crackle of flame, a slow bubble of water, and the patient, unending work of keeping the wolf from the door, the dark from the window, and the great, silent wheel of everyday life turning. One more day, as it always has, as it was always meant to. We've lingered long in the perpetual machine, listening to its rhythmic creaks and groans, the turning of the seasonal wheel, the endless replication of duty. It is a comforting thought, in a way, this idea of an immutable, self-repairing system. But even the most well-maintained machine develops faults. The most carefully replicated recipe eventually meets a slightly different ingredient. And the manor, for all its closed-loop ambitions, was not a sealed vessel. It was porous. The world had a way of seeping in through the cracks in the mortar, in ways both subtle and profound. The cycle could be interrupted, not by dramatic revolution, but by a slow, quiet accumulation of size. So let's consider the cracks. The first and most constant was simply information. The manor was not an island. The Lord traveled to court, to war, to tournaments. He brought back stories. His knights and retainers did the same. A servant with a cousin in the nearest town might hear a rumor and bring it back. These fragments of the outside world would circulate, a quiet currency of gossip that could, occasionally, alter the internal logic of the place. For instance, suppose a knight returns from a campaign in the East. He doesn't just bring stories of battles, he brings a new taste, a preference for a spice he encountered, a way of preparing meat, a style of sleeve. It seems trivial, but then the lady, Eleanor, hearing of it, might ask her cook to attempt a dish with more pepper, or to cut a gown with a slightly different line. It's a tiny deviation, a barely noticeable wobble in the wheel. But it happens. The recipe book gains a marginal note. The perpetual machine just ingested a foreign element, and it has to digest it, making it part of itself. This is how change often arrived, not as a conquering army, but as a whispered preference. Then there were the slower, deeper tremors, like the Black Death. We think of it as a cataclysm, which it was, but for the manor in its midst, it was also a series of terrifying, quiet absences. It wasn't just the dying. It was the disruption of the cycle. The shepherd dies, and the sheep scatter. The head plowman dies, and who knows when to plant the north field. The wet nurse dies, and the infant wails for a sustenance that is gone. The system, built on specific people and specific roles, breaks down. The meticulous lists in Eleanor's ledger are rendered nonsense by a stroke of a pestilential pen. And in the aftermath, a strange thing happened. With so many dead, the survivors, those humble, unseen cogs, found themselves in sudden, terrifying demand. Their labor was now scarce, and therefore valuable. A plowman could suddenly ask for higher wages, or even leave his tenancy to seek better terms elsewhere. The lord, desperate to have his fields tilled, might have to agree. It was a tiny shift in power, a quiet crack in the foundation of obligation and service. The machine could be repaired, but it would never run exactly the same way again. The memory of that bargaining power, once tasted, did not entirely fade. Religion was another crack, or perhaps a constant, low-grade seismic fault. The daily prayers, the feast days, the tithes to the church, these were baked into the cycle. But then a preacher might come through the village, a fiery one, speaking of a more personal God, of corruption in the abbey, of reading the scripture for oneself. The lord and lady might dismiss him as a rabble-rouser. But what of the baker, who listened at the back of the crowd, or the laundress, who found a strange comfort in his words? Her internal world, her private solace, might shift a degree. She would still do her work, still curtsy to her mistress, but the inner justification for her place in the great chain of being might have developed a hairline fracture. These were silent, internal rebellions, the kind that left no mark on the account books, but changed the weather inside a person. And of course, there was the most intimate crack of all, personal unhappiness. The system assumed compliance. It assumed that the lord would be dutiful, the lady capable, the children obedient, the servants resigned. But what if the lord was a spendthrift or a cruel brute? What if the lady was incapable of bearing an heir, or fell into a melancholy no prayer could lift? What if the heir preferred books to battles, or the daughter loved the stable boy and not the betrothed knight from the neighboring estate? These were narrative failures, glitches in the story everyone was supposed to be acting out. They caused immense, quiet dysfunction. A cruel lord meant a fearful, inefficient household. A melancholic lady meant a still room falling into disarray, her keys unused. A wayward heir meant anxious whispers and contingency plans that always felt faintly shameful. The machine was designed for rational, if grim, efficiency. It had no good protocol for the irrational human heart. So the manor, this bastion of continuity, was in a constant, low-level state of repair. Not from invading armies, but from the drip-drip-drip of human experience. A bad harvest year meant tightening belts and remembering hunger. A slight tremor in the economic foundations. A localized feud with a neighboring lord might mean the miller's daughter couldn't marry the yeoman's son from the next parish. A tiny disruption in the social web. A beloved old hound dying could send the lord into a week of quiet gloom that affected his judgments. The perpetual machine, therefore, wasn't a perfect engine. It was a practice, a daily, wearying act of will. It was the constant application of effort to hold the pattern together against the entropy of nature, the unpredictability of people, and the sheer, slow wear of time. Every day, Eleanor picked up her keys and went on her rounds. She wasn't just maintaining stores. She was applying a gentle, constant pressure to the cracks, pushing the stones of daily life back into alignment before the whole wall developed a lean. And eventually, of course, the wall would lean anyway. The world outside would change too much. New money from trade would create a class with influence, but no title, blurring the clear lines of hierarchy. New ideas from universities would slowly filter down, making the old certainties seem less certain. The manor's closed economy would be slowly integrated into a wider, more monetized one, making the old duties and payments seem archaic. But its end didn't come with a dramatic explosion. It came with a long, slow sigh. A generation that found the old ways slightly less convincing. A lord who sold off some of his customary rights for ready cash. A lady who preferred the fashionable townhouse to the drafty, key-laden castle. The machine didn't break. It gradually wound down, its rhythm slowing, becoming fainter, until one day, the fire in the still-room hearth was let out for the last time, and nobody bothered to relight it. Not with a bang, but with the quiet, final click of a lock for which the key had long been lost. And so, the great wheel turns, slows, and finally stills. The hearth in the great hall grows cold. The last key is turned in the last lock, perhaps for the final time. The herb bundles in the still room crumble to dust, their scent long faded. The stone walls, once bustling with the minutiae of survival, stand silent, listening only to the wind and the rain. The manor, as a living machine, has wound down. But history, especially the quiet kind, is less about dramatic endings and more about lingering echoes. The question then becomes not what ended, but what remains. What fragments of that perpetual, exhausting machine have drifted down to us, through the centuries, into our brightly lit, convenient, and often strangely lonely modern world. If you know where to look, the echoes are everywhere. They're just very, very faint. The most obvious are the stones themselves. A ruined castle keep on a hill, a moss-covered manor house repurposed as a farm building, the pattern of ridge and furrow in a field seen from an airplane window. These are the bones of the machine. We walk through them as tourists, with guidebooks and water bottles. We admire the thickness of the walls, the arrow slits, the grandeur of the great hall. But we have to strain to hear the other sounds. The clack-swish-thump of the loom is gone. The bubble of the soap cauldron is silent. The grumble of the turnspit boy's stomach is a phantom feeling. The stones hold the memory of volume, but not of the life that filled it. They are a cathedral to a faith no one practices anymore. The faith in hierarchy, in stewardship, in the slow, hard work of staying in one place. Then there are the words. Our language is littered with the fossilized remains of that world. We spin a tale, though few of us have ever touched a drop spindle. We describe a chaotic situation as bedlam, from the hospital of St. Mary of Bethlehem, a London asylum. We feel pangs of hunger, a word from the Old English for a sudden, sharp pain. The very word Lord comes from Laugh-Weird, the loaf warden, the keeper of the bread. The lady, Laugh-Dige, was the kneader of the loaf. Their highest titles were, at root, job descriptions from the pantry. Every time we use these words, we are, unconsciously, whispering a fragment of that lost reality. We are speaking in ghosts. The quieter echoes are in our habits, especially the ones we've begun to romanticize now that we've lost them. The modern obsession with farm-to-table dining, with artisanal soap, with hand-dipped candles, with knitting and gardening. It is a nostalgia for the tangible results of the perpetual machine, but without the back-breaking labor, the social coercion, and the sheer inescapability of it all. We make a lovely lavender soap as a weekend hobby, a pleasant diversion. For Eleanor, it was a quarterly necessity that left her hands raw and her nostrils full of the smell of lye. We romanticize the simple life, precisely because we have the privilege of choosing complexity. Our hobbyist still rooms are quiet museums to their own origins. And what of the people? The silent majority whose names are lost? Their echo is in the sheer, staggering weight of statistical probability. If you have any European ancestry at all, your family tree is not a majestic oak with famous names on its branches. It is a vast, dense thicket of countless, nameless peasants. For every king or queen in your distant past, there are 10,000 Eleanors and 100,000 scullions, plowmen, and dairymaids. Your genetic inheritance is not primarily one of royalty or nobility. It is overwhelmingly one of survivors. People who, through a combination of dumb luck, robust constitutions, and grim perseverance, managed to keep the wheel turning long enough to produce another generation. You are not the descendant of the machine's architects. You are the descendant of its most durable, most replaceable parts. And that is, in its own way, a more profound legacy. The deepest echo, however, is perhaps a psychological one. It's the leftover anxiety, the low-grade hum of worry that, despite our refrigerators and electric lights and global supply chains, things could still fall apart. The pandemic, for a fleeting moment, gave us a taste of it. The run on basic supplies, the fear of scarcity, the sudden importance of our own four walls. The medieval household lived with that feeling as a constant companion. Their entire existence was a bulwark against it. We have outsourced that bulwark to invisible systems and infrastructures we don't understand. But the ghost of the fear remains, a faint genetic memory of the long, hungry winters, of the empty salt barrel, of the cough that could turn into the death rattle. So, as we conclude our long, quiet meander through the days and duties of a world long gone, we are left not with a dramatic conclusion, but with a softening of focus. The manor fades into the mist of time. Eleanor's name, if she ever had one, is forgotten. The specific recipe for her comfort salve is lost. But the quiet remains. It's in the scent of rain on dry stone. It's in the satisfying weight of a key in your hand. It's in the hypnotic rhythm of a repetitive task. It's in the deep, ancient comfort of a stock pantry. It's in the silent, stubborn will to simply continue. We live in a world of deafening noise and blinding light, of endless stimulation and chronic hurry. The medieval world, for all its hardship and injustice, understood the value of quiet, of patience, of cycles that were slower than the human heartbeat. They built a whole civilization on the premise that some things should not change, that preservation was a virtue, and that the greatest victory was often just making it through to spring. Perhaps that's the final, quiet lesson from the still room. Not a lesson in how to live. Their world is too foreign for that, but a lesson in pace. A reminder that history is not just the loud, explosive events that shatter the silence. It is also, and perhaps mostly, the silence itself. The long, patient spaces in between. The slow accumulation of days. The gentle, relentless turning of a wheel that, for 1,000 years, kept the darkness at bay. One dipped candle, one salted barrel, one carefully stitched seam at a time. So next time you find yourself in a quiet moment, maybe turning off a bright screen, or simply sitting with your own thoughts, remember the weight of the keys. Remember the smell of the herbs. Remember the ache in the spinner's hands. And appreciate the quiet you have, not as an absence of sound, but as a vast, deep inheritance. The quiet that remains after all the work is done. Thank you for listening. Sleep well.